The solicitor's shoes made a sound on the flagstone that Clara had heard before, but not like this. Sharp, purposeful. The kind of step a man takes when he has papers that need signing and no patience for delay. She was carrying a breakfast tray down the main corridor when he came through the door, and she stopped because the household did not receive unannounced visitors at 8:30 in the morning, and because something in the way he moved through the entrance hall made the ordinary air of the place feel suddenly rearranged. He looked past her toward the drawing room. Then he looked past the drawing room toward the library stairs. Then he said a name. He said it the way names are said when they belong to someone who owns the room you are standing in. Clara had heard that name before in a different context, at a different volume. She had never put it together with the man in the plain wool coat who had been sleeping in the East Wing guest room for 12 days, and who sometimes stood at the library window looking out at the grounds as though he were calculating something she could not see. She had not put it together because there was no reason to put it together. He had arrived with a small leather bag and a reservation that Whitmore had processed without comment, and he had been, as far as Clara could tell, a quiet and unremarkable guest who made no demands and left his room in better order than most. The solicitor said the name a second time, louder, and the man in the plain wool coat came out of the library doorway and said, quietly, "Yes, I'm here." The sound of the tray's edge against the side table was small and involuntary. Clara set it down before anything could spill. She stood with her hands at her sides and understood, in a series of small and rapidly arriving pieces, that she had been wrong about everything she thought she knew about the last 12 days. Dorothea Whitmore came around the corner from the estate office at the sound of voices, already forming the expression she used when staff had allowed something irregular into the front of the house. The expression did not finish forming. It stopped part way and stayed there like a sentence interrupted by weather. That was the morning the house changed. What came before it is the part that matters. Clara Moss had worked at Ashford Manor for 9 years. She had come at 26, with a reference from a smaller house in the county and a plain determination to be useful, and she had stayed because the house itself was beautiful in a way she had not expected, and because the work was the kind that rewarded attention. Ashford was large enough to require constant management and old enough to require constant care, and she had found, over 9 years, that she was good at both. She knew which windows leaked cold air in November and how to pack the frames without replacing the glass. She knew which of the upstairs chimneys drew poorly in a north wind and how to coax a fire through it. She knew the names of the men who delivered the coal and the women who brought the linens, and she knew, because she had learned it early, that knowing those names was not a small thing. Dorothea Whitmore had come to Ashford 3 years ago, appointed as estate manager by the solicitor's firm that handled the property during the owner's long absence. She was efficient in the way that machinery is efficient, which is to say she accomplished what she set out to accomplish without any particular regard for what was in her path. She had reorganized the household accounts, renegotiated 2 supplier contracts, and reduced the seasonal staff by 4, all of which the solicitor's quarterly reports had registered with approval. She had also, in those same 3 years, made Clara's position at Ashford into something that required daily negotiation. It was not that Whitmore disliked Clara specifically. It was that Whitmore's sense of how a household should be ordered left no comfortable space for a woman who had been there before her and who was trusted by the people who had been there even longer. Clara knew where the spare key to the coal cellar was kept. Clara knew which mornings Neville's joints made the east path impassable for him and adjusted the outdoor task list accordingly. Clara knew things about Ashford that could not be acquired by reading the estate manager's manual, And Whitmore had learned in 3 years that this kind of knowledge is either incorporated or eliminated. She had chosen elimination. The morning of the staff breakfast, 8 days before the solicitor arrived, Whitmore had made her intentions audible without making them explicit. The table had been set in the kitchen, as it was every Wednesday morning, with the staff arranged by the informal order that had existed before Whitmore came, which she had never bothered to formalize because it served her well enough to leave the hierarchy implied. Mrs. Pruitt sat to Whitmore's left, as she always did, her coffee cup held in both hands, and her attention moving between her employer and the room with the practiced readiness of someone waiting for an occasion to be useful. Clara had set the table herself that morning, as she did most mornings, because the kitchen assistant was behind with the bread and someone had to see to it. She had set Neville's place with the chair pushed slightly back from the table because his hip had been troubling him, and she had learned that a few inches of clearance made the difference between a meal he could sit through and one he couldn't. Neville Oakes had worked Ashford's grounds for 30 years. His hands were the colour and texture of the bark on the old oak at the south gate, and he had the particular stillness of a man who has spent decades watching weather approach from the horizon and learning to measure it. He said very little at the breakfast table. He had, over those 30 years, developed a nearly complete indifference to the opinions of estate managers, which had served him well through several of them. He looked at the pushed-out chair when he came in, and he sat down in it without comment, and he looked at Clara with an expression that registered what she had done without requiring him to name it. Whitmore had been watching. "Clara," she said when everyone was seated and the bread had come, "I noticed the east corridor lamps were not lit this morning." Clara looked up from her plate. "The oil delivery was short. I've logged it. The order's been placed for Thursday. The guest in the east wing will have noticed. He hasn't said anything. He wouldn't, would he?" Whitmore said it not as a question. She set down her cup with the particular deliberateness of someone making a point that doesn't require words. "The guest in the east wing pays for a certain standard of service. Whether he mentions its absence is not the measure we use." Mrs. Pruitt made a small sound of agreement that was not quite a word. "I'll arrange a candle lantern for the corridor until Thursday," Clara said. "I'd prefer you'd arrange the oil delivery to arrive on time." It was the tone more than the content. The tone was the instrument Whitmore used with the precision of long practice. She did not shout. She did not demean in language that could be repeated verbatim to a third party, and clearly understood as cruel. She managed the implication. She managed the register of barely restrained patience that suggested Clara had, again, fallen short of a standard that any competent person would have met without prompting. The effect, over 3 years, was the effect of water on stone. Patient, continuous, aimed at a specific place. Neville stared at the bread in front of him. His jaw moved once as if something had briefly crossed his mind, and he had decided, for the moment, to keep it there. Clara said nothing more. She finished her breakfast, cleared her plate, and went upstairs to prepare the east wing corridor with a candle lantern, which she set on the small ledge beneath the third window, where the light would catch the flagstone in the morning and not look like an apology. It was there on her way back down with the empty tray that she encountered the guest. He was standing at the end of the corridor with his hands in the pockets of the plain wool coat he seemed to wear every day, regardless of whether he was inside or out. He was looking at the lantern on the ledge with the expression of a man who is adding a small piece of evidence to a larger picture he has been assembling for some time. When he heard her step, he turned, and he did not look surprised. "The oil delivery was short," Clara said, because it seemed better to explain than to let the silence accumulate. "It's been ordered for Thursday." "The lantern is a reasonable solution," he said. His name, as far as she knew it, was Robert. He had signed the guest register as R. Hayes. He had been polite in every exchange they had had, which had not been many. He asked for nothing beyond what the room offered and had, on the third day, returned the extra pillow from his bed to the linen cupboard himself, leaving a small note on the cupboard door in neat handwriting that said he'd found the second pillow unnecessary and preferred the cupboard not be full. Clara had kept the note. She could not have said why. She had tucked it under the edge of the cupboard latch, where it would not be found by anyone looking, and she had not thought about it consciously after that, though she had noticed each morning that it was still there. "I hope the lamplighter arrangement won't trouble you," she said. "It won't." He paused. "Do you always arrange substitutions before anyone asks for them?" She considered the question for a moment, unsure whether it was criticism or genuine curiosity. His face was neutral in a way that was different from Whitmore's neutrality. Whitmore's face was a closed door. His was more like a window with the curtain drawn, which is different in ways that are difficult to name. "There's no point waiting for a problem to be noticed when you can address it first," she said. He nodded once. "That's an efficient way of looking at it." She went downstairs and did not think much more about it. She had a house to manage. The grounds behind Ashford's east garden had a path Neville used most mornings, a narrow track between the old stone wall and the rose beds that he walked twice before the household was properly awake, checking the drainage channels he'd built in 1994 and the beds he'd replanted twice since. His hands had been giving him trouble since October. Not badly, but enough that the morning inspection took longer than it used to, and Clara had seen him on 2 or 3 occasions, stopping partway down the path to work his fingers open and closed in the cold air until the stiffness released. She had begun, without making a decision about it, leaving a pair of lined work gloves at the end of the path each morning, on the flat stone beside the drainage grate, where he turned to come back. She did not say anything to him about it. She set them there before he came out, and when he returned through the kitchen door, the gloves came with him, and that was the whole of the exchange. He had never mentioned it. She had never mentioned it. On the morning of the 4th day of Robert's stay, he was standing by the stone wall when Clara came out with the gloves. He was far enough back and quiet enough that she did not see him at first. She set the gloves on the flat stone, smoothed them straight so they wouldn't catch the wind, and went back inside. He stayed by the wall for another minute. She did not know this. She had already gone back to the bread. The kitchen at Ashford ran on a schedule that had been built over years and refined by whoever understood it best, which had for the past 9 years been Clara. The morning tasks ran from 5:30 to 8, the mid-morning tasks from 8 to 11, and the afternoon preparation from 1 to 4. There was a gap between 4 and 5:30 that Whitmore had, on several occasions, tried to fill with additional inventory audits, and which Clara had, on several occasions, protected for the staff's sake because everyone needed 45 minutes somewhere in the day that was simply theirs. That gap on the 6th evening of Robert's stay was how the library came to hold 2 people instead of 1. Clara had come in to tend the fire, which was her responsibility in the rooms that guests used in the evening, and found Robert already there with a book open in his lap. She apologized for the interruption. He said there was no interruption, and the way he said it implied that he meant it, which was different from how guests usually said things that implied things they didn't mean. She tended the fire. She was aware, as she worked the grate, of his stillness in the chair. Not the stillness of someone deliberately not looking, the stillness of someone comfortable. "You've worked here a long time," he said. She looked up. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the fire. 9 years, she said. Longer than most of the staff. Longer than the current ones. He turned a page. Does the house feel like it fits you, or do you feel like you fit the house? She sat back on her heels and thought about that. I'm not sure they're different questions, she said. He seemed to consider that. He didn't press it. He returned to his book and she finished with the fire, and she stood for a moment in the doorway on her way out because the room was warm, and the evening was quiet, and it was not often that Ashford felt like a place that required simply standing in. She was aware of his presence in the chair with the same quality of awareness she had when the house was at its best, when everything that needed doing had been done, and the result was a kind of stillness that was indistinguishable from rightness. She went out and pulled the door mostly shut, leaving an inch of gap for the warmth to move through the corridor, as it always did in the old part of the house. He did not move in the chair for a long time after that. The week's worst moment arrived on a Wednesday. Clara was in the kitchen corridor at the far end near the coal chute, doing the afternoon linen count, which required a certain quality of concentration that made her, to all outward appearances, invisible. She was not hiding, she was counting. The difference mattered to her even after the fact, though she could not have explained why the distinction seemed important, except that what she heard was not something she had sought. Whitmore was in the estate office, which shared a ventilation shaft with the corridor, a fact the house's original builders had not considered problematic and which had, over the years, made the corridor into an involuntary archive of conversations that were not meant to travel. Whitmore was on the telephone. Clara registered the voice before she registered the words, the way you register that music has started before you can identify the melody. Then the words assembled themselves, and she stood quite still. Before the annual review, Whitmore was saying, I want it done before the annual review so the numbers are clean going in. She's been there too long. The longer someone like that stays, the more they think the house belongs to them. A pause. The other side of the conversation was inaudible. I have grounds, Whitmore said. The East Wing lamps. The third-floor linen count from September. I've been keeping records. Another pause. It's not personal. She's simply in a position that requires someone with a different disposition. Someone who understands that their role is their role, and nothing beyond it. The ventilation shaft transmitted the end of the call, and then was quiet. Clara stood in the corridor for a moment that was longer than most moments. She looked at the linens in her arms. She looked at the count sheet on the shelf. She picked up the pencil and finished the count. She did not make an error in it. She went upstairs and finished the afternoon tasks and came down to start the evening preparation. And she did not let her hands shake, and she did not say anything to anyone. And the house moved around her with its usual particular sound, the sound of a large old building adjusting itself against the temperature of the evening, timber and stone and glass all moving in fractions that no one notices unless they have been listening for 9 years. She had thought, over the years, that Ashford was her work in a way that felt different from simply being employed. Not ownership. She had never confused herself about that. But the particular kind of belonging that comes from being the person who knows where the draft comes in and which chimney speaks in the north wind. That kind of belonging. She had thought it was reciprocal in some way she could not have named. Now she sat with the fact that Whitmore had records, that the East Wing lamps and the September linen count, which she had resolved and corrected without drama and without cost to the household, had been collected and stored like evidence, that her 9 years could be presented to an annual review as a ledger of small failings, each one real enough to have existed, each one small enough to be manageable, together adding up to a case. She thought about leaving first. She thought about it carefully, the way you think about a door that has always been there and that you have never had reason to use. Then she thought about the morning bread and the candle lantern, and Neville's gloves on the flat stone, and she decided that she was not going to be the one to leave the house dark. She went to bed and set her alarm for 5:15. The next morning she rose in the dark and came downstairs and began. The bread first, because it required the longest rise and had to be started before anything else, or the timing of the whole morning fell apart. She shaped the loaves the way she had learned from the woman who had been cook here before her, a Mrs. Aldridge who had shaped them with a particular double fold that released the air differently from the standard method and made the crust hold its texture for longer. Clara had learned the fold by watching until she could do it without thinking about it. And she did it now in the dark kitchen with the dough warm under her hands and the rest of the house still entirely silent. The coal for the kitchen range, the water for the upstairs ewers, each one measured, each one at the temperature she had learned each room preferred. The flowers in the entrance hall, replaced because Thursday's arrangement had gone a day past presentable and the hall deserved better. The corridor between the dining room and the drawing room, which had a stone section near the far end that collected a particular kind of grey dust that did not respond to the standard treatment and required the long-handled brush used at a specific angle. She knew all of these things. She did all of them. She did them because they needed doing and because she was the person who knew how, and she did them the day after she had learned she was going to be dismissed, with the same thoroughness she had applied to them every other day for 9 years. This was not courage performed for an audience. There was no audience. There was only the house and the morning and the work. Neville came out for his morning walk and found his gloves on the flat stone, as they had been every morning. He looked at them for a moment with an expression that went somewhat past simple acknowledgement. He had noticed in the last several days the man who stood by the wall. He had noticed the quality of the man's attention when it was directed at the house, which was the attention of someone reading something in the stone and the ground and the arrangement of the place that other people did not think to read. He had worked 30 years at Ashford. He recognized that quality of attention because he had seen it in one other person he could think of, and that person had not been a guest. He put on the gloves and started down the path. The solicitor's name was Mr. Cantwell, and he had been managing the Hayes family's affairs for 11 years, which meant he had managed the period of Robert's long absence from Ashford and the appointment of the estate management firm and the delegation of household authority to Dorothea Whitmore, all of it conducted at a distance through correspondence and quarterly calls. He drove up the gravel drive at 8:30 in the morning on a day that was cold and bright, with a leather briefcase and a specific sense of what needed to be accomplished before noon. He had been told that Mr. Hayes was at the property. He had not been told that Mr. Hayes had been at the property for 12 days under circumstances that the rest of the household had not been informed of, and if he found this unusual, his face did not particularly show it. He was a solicitor. He had seen most varieties of his client's behaviour, and the Hayes family had produced several. He came through the front door, which Clara had unlocked at 7, as she always did, and looked around the entrance hall with the quick proprietary glance of a man who had been here before and was confirming that the thing he remembered and the thing in front of him were the same. They were largely the same. The flowers were fresh. The floor was clean. The hall smelled of the particular mix of beeswax and old stone that Ashford always smelled of at its best. He looked past the hall toward the dining room, then toward the library stairs. "Mr. Hayes," he said conversationally, as if completing a thought. "Mr. Robert Hayes." Clara had been coming down the corridor with the breakfast tray. She stopped. Robert came out of the library doorway. He looked at Cantwell with the patient expression of a man who had been expecting this arrival and was prepared for what came with it. He was still in the plain wool coat which he wore every day without apparent concern for its ordinariness. He said, "Yes, I'm here." And then, after a moment, "Come into the study. There are papers. Cantwell moved toward him with the brisk reliability of a man who has walked this particular path before, and the two of them went through the door at the end of the corridor that led to the estate's private study, which had been locked for 3 years, and which, Clara now registered, Robert had been carrying a key to. Dorothea Whitmore came around the corner from the estate office in the way she always came around corners, with the air of someone whose authority extends through walls. She had heard Cantwell's voice. She had heard the name he said. She stopped 3 feet from Clara, and the expression that had been forming on her face did not finish forming. Mrs. Pruitt appeared behind her from the direction of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a cloth, drawn by the sound of an arrival she hadn't been informed of. She looked at Whitmore. Whitmore did not look back. The 3 of them stood in the corridor, and the house was very quiet. Clara set the tray down on the side table because her hands had learned to do the sensible thing, even when her mind was occupied with something else entirely. She thought about 12 days. She thought about the wool coat and the guest register and the handwritten note on the linen cupboard door. She thought about the library and the fire and the question he had asked about the house fitting her. She thought about the way he had stood at the stone wall watching her set the gloves on the flat stone, which she had not known he was doing until now, and which, now, made a complete kind of sense that she had not had the pieces for before. She thought, briefly, about the morning she had gotten up at 5:15 and made the bread, and arranged the flowers, and swept the far corridor with a long-handled brush, with no audience, in a house she believed she was about to lose. She thought he might have known about that morning. The study door opened after 40 minutes. Robert came out first. Cantwell followed and stood with his briefcase held correctly, his expression composed. Robert looked at Clara. He looked at her the way he had looked at the lantern on the ledge the first morning, adding a piece of evidence to a picture he had been building, except the picture was now complete, and he was simply confirming it. He looked at Whitmore. It was a particular kind of look. Not cold, not punishing. The look of a man who has had 12 days to observe a thing and is now in a position where the observation is available to be stated plainly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, and his voice was exactly the same voice he had used in the library and the corridor, level, unhurried, entirely itself. "I believe Mr. Cantwell has some matters to discuss with you regarding the estate management agreement. It would be best to do that now." Whitmore's face moved through several things in a short time. The beginning of a question, the withdrawal of the question, the recognition of what the question would reveal if asked, the calculation of what the appropriate register of response was, and the discovery that no previous calculation of that register applied to this situation. "Of course," she said finally, and her voice came out at a pitch that was not quite the pitch she intended, and she knew it, and Clara knew it, and Robert gave no sign that he had noticed, which was its own form of conclusion. Mrs. Pruitt had stopped wiping her hands. She was holding the cloth with both of them, pressed together, her eyes moving between Whitmore and Robert, with the expression of a woman recalibrating everything she had decided to agree with over the past 3 years. Cantwell held the estate office door open. Whitmore went in. The door closed. Neville came in from the garden through the kitchen door, as he did every morning at this hour, and made his way up the back stairs to the corridor. He had come, these past days, with a specific and patient suspicion that he had not shared with anyone because he was not a man who stated things before they were confirmed, and because in 30 years he had learned to wait for the thing to become itself rather than rushing toward it. He came into the corridor and looked at Robert standing in the entrance hall and at Clara standing a few feet from him, and he looked at the study door standing open and the estate office door standing closed, and his expression did not change because it was already the expression of a man whose suspicion has been confirmed. He took the gloves off and held them in one hand and looked at Robert. "Your father planted the oak at the south gate," he said. "He did," Robert said. "In 1978. Neville nodded once. He had known the elder Mr. Hayes for 20 years, and he was not given to sentiment, but there was something in the set of his jaw that acknowledged a long patience being brought to rest. He went to the kitchen without further ceremony, because the bread had come out and someone needed to see to it, and because 30 years had made him the kind of man who trusted the house to settle itself once the right person was standing in it. Robert turned back to Clara. She was looking at him with the careful, level attention she gave to things that required being thought through before they were spoken to. He waited for it. 12 days, she said. 12 days, he confirmed. You watched how the house runs. She was not asking. I needed to know what it was when no one was performing it for me. She considered that. She thought about what she had given Ashford in 12 days, without knowing she was being watched, which was exactly what she had given it in every other set of 12 days, for 9 years, which was the same thing it always was, which was all of it. She thought about the bread this morning. She thought about Neville's gloves on the cold stone. She thought about the candle lantern in the east corridor and the double fold in the bread dough and the long-handled brush at the specific angle. "And," she said. "And," he said, "I think the house has been very well kept by someone who deserved considerably better than what she was given in return for it." She looked at him for a moment, without speaking. The entrance hall held them both in its particular light, the light that came through the east windows in the morning and caught the stone floor at an angle that made it look like water. She had seen that light for 9 years, and it was, as always, the most beautiful part of the morning. And it was the same light it had always been, and the person standing in it was not who she had thought, but then again, she thought, he might have been exactly who she had thought all along, wearing simply the version of himself he had been waiting to stop hiding. "What happens now?" she said. "Now, Mr. Cantwell resolves the management question. After that, Ashford needs a senior housekeeper who knows the house and chooses to stay in it." He paused. "That's a different offer than the one you've been living with." She was quiet. Through the wall, faintly, she could hear the estate office, the low procedural cadences of a formal conversation arriving at a conclusion it had been building toward for some time. She did not feel triumph about it. She felt something quieter than triumph, the particular stillness of a thing being corrected rather than a thing being won. "I'll stay," she said. She said it in the same tone she said everything, level, without decoration, without asking it to carry more than what it said. He received it in the same spirit. The estate office conversation lasted another 20 minutes. When the door opened, Cantwell came out first with his briefcase and looked at no one in particular with the expression of a man who has concluded a thing that needed concluding. Whitmore came out behind him. She had, in those 20 minutes, located the version of her bearing that she intended to use for the departure, which was the version that suggested this outcome was within the range of things she had anticipated, which was not true, and which Robert did not bother to contest. She looked at Clara once. The look had none of its previous architecture. The quiet machinery of implication, the register of barely restrained patience, the suggestion of inadequacy managed at a reasonable volume, none of it assembled in the look. What remained was simply the look of a person who had been wrong about what the house was, and who was leaving without the cover of having been right. "Good morning," Clara said to her because it was and because she was not going to send her out any other way. Whitmore went. Mrs. Pruitt, who had stood in the kitchen doorway through most of this, looked at the floor and then looked at Clara and offered nothing, because she had nothing left to offer except silence and a faint, revised understanding of where she stood. Clara let her have it without comment. Cantwell shook Robert's hand at the front door and said he'd have the remaining paperwork in order by Friday, and Robert said that would be fine. And Cantwell went down the front steps and got into his car with the same brisk reliability he'd arrived with, and the gravel spoke under the tires, and then was quiet. The house had its late morning sound now, the sound it had between the end of the breakfast service and the beginning of the lunch preparation, a particular hush that was not absence, but completion, the sound of tasks finished and the next ones not yet started. Neville was in the kitchen with his tea. Mrs. Pruitt had found something to do with herself in the upper corridor. The bread was cooling on the counter, the double-fold crust holding its shape as it always did when she got the temperature right. Robert was standing at the kitchen doorway. He had been looking at the grounds through the window, at the garden path and the stone wall, and the flat stone beside the drainage grate where the gloves had been every morning. He turned when he heard Clara come in from the corridor. She went to the bread first because it needed to come off the rack before the crust set too hard, and she moved it with the cloth that lived on the counter peg and set it on the board and put the cloth back where it lived. Then she looked up. He was watching her with an expression she recognized from the first day she had met him, which had been in the corridor outside the east wing, when he had looked at the candle lantern on the ledge and added it to the picture he was building. The expression of a man who has been paying careful attention and is now looking at the thing the attention was for. "The bread is the double-fold method," she said, because something needed to be said, and this was true. "It keeps longer." "I noticed," he said, "your predecessor's technique." She looked at him. "You've been here before." "My mother learned it from Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "She was here when I was a child." Clara set the cloth back on its peg. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge, who had been here before her, and the fold that she had taught herself by watching, and the fact that it had been here in the house before either of them, in the form of a small inheritance, passed through hands, and that it had stayed because someone had paid enough attention to learn it. She thought about what it meant that he had grown up in this kitchen and had come back to it in a plain wool coat and watched it from a distance for 12 days to see if what his father had built was still alive in the walls, and the work and the people who showed up at 5:15 in the morning when there was no reason to, and every reason not to. "You should have said," she said, "who you were." "I know," he said, and there was something in the two words that was not exactly apology and not exactly justification. It was the sound of a person who has held a decision for a long time and is willing to own the weight of it without asking for the weight to be removed. She nodded. "The annual review is in 3 weeks." "I know that too. There are things Whitmore hadn't been managing properly. The East Garden drainage, the third-floor window seals. I've been logging them." "I imagined you had." She pulled the second loaf forward on the board and smoothed the cloth over the edge. Her hands knew this task the way they knew all the tasks, from the inside without needing to think about the steps. Ashford's kitchen was morning light and old stone, and the smell of bread coming off the board, and it was the place where she had spent more of her life than anywhere else. And she was going to be here tomorrow and the day after, and the review in 3 weeks would have her logs and her records, and 9 years of double-fold bread that kept longer than the standard method. Neville had finished his tea. He carried his cup to the counter and set it down with the particular, quiet care of a man who has learned that cups and mornings are both worth treating well. He looked at Robert with the direct and unhurried gaze he gave to things he had been right about. "He looks like his father did at that age," he said to Clara, as if reporting a fact of the grounds, something observable and verifiable and not particularly in question. "Same way of standing." He went back out through the kitchen door to the garden path, and the door settled in its frame with the sound it always made, the particular sound of old wood and a latch that had been fitted to a specific door in a specific house for a long time. Clara looked at the door for a moment after it closed. Then she looked at Robert. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hands at his sides, in the plain wool coat, in the light that came through the window from the garden, and the house moved around them with its own specific sound, the sound that a house makes when the right person is standing in it, and the work has been done, and the bread is cooling, and the morning is continuing exactly as it should, which is to say, quietly, warmly, in the particular fullness of a place that has been cared for by someone who knows it from the inside, and who is, at last, being seen. She turned back to the bread and began to slice it for the morning service, and he stayed in the doorway, and neither of them said anything more because the house said it for them, as it always had, in the language of light on stone and work done well, and the slow, certain knowledge of belonging.